hot, dry. That is the story of the year so far. Last year, though, was quite a lot cooler. The Met Office has been reviewing its data for 2021 to analyse what it tells us about how our climate is changing. Mike Kendon is the man who wrote the report for the Met Office. He's a climate information scientist. He joins us now. Morning to you.
Good morning.
It wasn't that hot last year, was it?
Well, that's right. 2021 was actually fairly near average overall when we look at the temperature and the rainfall and the sunshine last year. So compared to the last 30 years, it was fairly near average. But what's really interesting is that if we consider that in the context of our full climate series, which extend back to 1884, before 1990, it would have been one of the warmest years on record. So what we're regarding now as a fairly normal year, only just over 30 years ago, we would have regarded as really very warm indeed. So our perception of what is normal is changing as our climate for the UK is warming. In our long-running series, all 10 warmest years in our series from 1884 have occurred this century. And we have a very long-running series called the Central England Temperature Series. That goes all the way back 3 centuries. And we can see from that this century so far has been warmer than the previous 3 centuries. And together with that, other things are changing. So in the most recent decade, if we compare that to 1961 to 1990, the number of air frosts we get in the UK has reduced by 21%. The number of ground frosts in the UK has reduced by 18%. The amount of heating degree days, this is a measure of heating required in the winter, has reduced by 11%. But the flip side is that a different index of cooling degree days for cooling our homes in summer has increased from 9 to 16. So we're seeing really large changes. When you say
cooling days, just spell it out if you would.
Yeah, so this is a measure, it's an index which measures how much we need to cool our homes if the average temperature each day goes above 22.5 degrees.
Yeah, permafrost is fascinating. There are other things you observe. You look at sea levels, aren't you, and they're rising fast.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a contribution in the report from the National Oceanography Centre that looks at the sea level rise around the UK. Of course, the sea level rises as the planet warms due to 2 things. Firstly, as the ocean warms, we have thermal expansion. The second thing is, of course, melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. So from the start of the 20th century, sea level has risen by about 1.5 millimetres per year. It doesn't sound much, but that's actually 16.5 centimetres from 1900 to date. But what's really interesting is that if we look at the last 30-year period, the trends in that have increased to more like 3 millimetres to 5 millimetres a year over the last 30 years, so it's accelerating.
Now, one of the other things in the report that caught my eye was a change to when we see the leaves on trees, and to when they fall, those leaves as well?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a section with a really wonderful contribution we're very grateful for from the Woodland Trust, looking at first leaf dates and bare tree dates provided by volunteers to the Woodland Trust. So first leaf dates for 2021, it was quite a complex mixed picture. We had a warm March, so species which tend to leaf earlier, leafed earlier in the season, leafed earlier than normal due to that warm March. But we then had a very, very unusually cold April with lots of frosts. So species that leaf later, like oak, they leafed even later than normal. We had a warm autumn, and the species didn't drop their leaves till much later. So overall, it's a complex picture.
Yeah, people noticing a lot of leaves on the ground at the moment. Is that related to the heat that we're seeing?
Well, it's hard to comment on that, quite possibly. But look,
you're a climate man rather than a leaf man.
I am indeed. But the 40 degrees we had last week, let's be clear, that was a moment of climate history for the UK. 40 degrees for the first time. And if we see a weather station with a record that goes back 100 years, which is smashed by a 4-degree margin, that's a coach and horses through that record. Really, that's extraordinary.
Mike Kendon, we've got to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. If you know the answer to the leaves on the ground, do get in touch today at bbc.co.uk. I'd be interested to know. Mike Kendon there from the Met Office.
I'm sure one of our expert listeners will know that. Well, those are the long-term trends for climate and weather. Let's find out what's going to be happening more immediately at 3 minutes to 7. Chris Fawkes is standing by. Hi, Chris.
Well, yes, it's quite worrying that, isn't it? Yeah, 4 out of the 5 highest temperature ever recorded in the UK have been just in the last 4 years, would you believe it? Now, looking at the weather picture today, well, we've got a band of rain that's affecting parts of northern England, but for the majority of the UK, there's going to be a lot of cloud around today. That area of rain will be moving northwards into parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland as we progress through the day. But little rainfall where we need it across parts of southern England where it's pretty much been bone dry in places all month. Now looking at the weather picture in a bit more detail, and for Wales, the Midlands, East Anglia, southern counties of England, we're looking at a rather cloudy start to the day. There are a few breaks in the cloud coming along to parts of Wales, southwest England, and we've got a few opening up in southeast England as well. So it's not going to be completely wall-to-wall cloudy, but there will be often a lot of cloud. Into the afternoon, a few showers popping up across Wales and southwest England, very hit and miss in nature. Temperatures today in the low 20s, 20 to 23 degrees. Now for northern England, we start off on a damp note with a band of rain. That rain will slowly move its way northwards, so it will become drier and a little bit brighter across northern England into the afternoon, with temperatures reaching a high of 20. Northern Ireland, showers develop through the day with more general rain, probably pushing into Antrim and down, 18 degrees here. And for Scotland, we've got rain moving into southern and central areas, the north staying dry and bright, highs up to 20. That's the latest.
Chris, thank you. Later this morning, we'll hear about the big cat making a comeback in Nepal.
On BBC Radio 4. The new series of Crossing Continents reports on a conservation success story.
Tigers are the majestic creatures. Being assigned in the protection duties, it's an honor.
I'm Rebecca Hinchke in Nepal, where the number of tigers has more than doubled in the last 10 years. How have they managed it, and at what cost?
The common area that the tigers and the prey species and the humanity shares is so tight. The community lives in terror.
The new series of Crossing Continents on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds, starting this morning at 11.
And coming up in the next hour of this programme, Sir Lenny Henry, who brought the Commonwealth baton to Victoria Square behind me, on why he's supporting the Games, and his sneak preview of tonight's opening ceremony, and also on the sport itself, Olympic medalists, including Max Whitlock, the gymnast.
You're listening to Today with Martha in Birmingham and Nick Robinson here in London. Good morning, it's 7 o'clock on Thursday the 28th of July. The headlines this morning: more than 5,000 athletes from 72 nations and territories will be taking part in the Commonwealth Games, which get underway in Birmingham today. Union leaders and several Labour MPs have criticised the decision to sack a shadow minister who joined striking rail workers on a picket line. And the Met Office say sea levels around the UK are rising at an accelerated pace as temperatures increase. The BBC News is read this morning by Alan Smith.
What organisers say is the biggest ever Commonwealth Games begins in Birmingham later today, with Prince Charles representing the Queen at an opening ceremony that's expected to be watched by millions around the world. £750 million of public money has been spent getting everything ready for the Games, which is the first major event to fully integrate para-sports into its main schedule. More than 5,000 athletes from 72 nations and territories will take part over 11 days. Our Midlands correspondent Phil Mackey reports.
The Queen's baton was cheered all the way through Birmingham on the final leg of its journey to tonight's opening ceremony at the newly revamped Alexander Stadium. Duran Duran will headline the show, which has been produced by the Peaky Blinders creator Stephen Knight. They're still putting the finishing touches across the city centre. There are new floral displays and the constant smell of fresh paint. The latest tram route, which has opened just in time for the event, is a sign of how Birmingham and the wider West Midlands has benefited from the massive investment brought by the Games. The biggest sporting legacy will be the new aquatic centre built just outside Birmingham in Snevick. It's hoped the cultural legacy will also revitalise a region that's often felt unloved and overlooked in the past.
Unions have reacted angrily to the decision by the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer to sack Sam Tarry as a shadow transport minister after he joined striking rail workers on a picket line yesterday. Several Labour MPs have also criticised the move, saying Mr Tarry was right to be championing the rights of workers. Here's our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus.
Sharon Graham, who leads the Unite union, which has more than 1 million members, said Labour was becoming more and more irrelevant to ordinary working people following the sacking of Sam Tarry. According to Labour, Mr Tarry was not removed from his shadow cabinet job because he appeared on a picket line yesterday, but because, while there, he broke rules that say all shadow ministers must get prior approval for any broadcast interviews and must stick to party lines. Live on TV, Mr Tarry had said that workers should get pay rises in line with inflation. The TSSA transport union, of which Mr Tarry is a former member, responded saying Labour was deluded if it thought it could win the next election while pushing away 7 million trade union members. The Labour MP, Mick Whitley, said Mr Tarry had been right to stand with strikers. Another MP, Rachel Maskell, said Labour politicians were in Parliament to be the voice of workers seeking decent pay.
Network Rail has said that disruption to trains will continue this morning because of the knock-on effect of yesterday's RMT strike. Several operators have warned that services will start later than usual. A safeguarding review of the events leading up to the murder of 13-month-old Leland James Corkill in Cumbria will be published later today. He was killed in January last year by Laura Castle, a woman who'd hoped to adopt him. In her first interview, Leland James's mother, Laura Corkill, said her son was wrongly removed at birth and would still be alive if he'd been left with her. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas reports.
Laura Corkill says Leland James was taken from his hospital cot by a social worker 2 days after his birth. She says she repeatedly asked for him to come home and continued to see him at a contact centre until COVID stopped face-to-face access. She believes extreme domestic violence she suffered in the past led to social workers believing her child would not be safe with her.
Instead of taking children off the mothers who are a victim of domestic violence, support them more instead of just going in and taking their children. I was nothing, I was nobody, and they tried to make me forget that I was a mother.
Laura Corkill says after Leland James died, a social worker refused to say which hospital he was in, and when they did, he was dead by the time she arrived. Cumbria County Council say at the time the extent of his injuries wasn't known, and that Laura Corkill was supported by her own social worker. They added that in July 2020, the family courts agreed that Leland James should be adopted, and when a child was at risk of harm, they had a duty to act.
NHS leaders say the acute shortage of staff to care for people in residential homes or in their own properties is having a significant effect on hospitals. The NHS Confederation says patients are ending up on hospital wards or in accident and emergency. The government says billions of pounds of extra investment will bring about major reforms in adult social care. Here's our social affairs editor, Alison Holt.
Almost 250 health managers and leaders responded to questions from the NHS Confederation. Nearly all said the staffing crisis in social care was putting the care and safety of NHS patients at risk, with one manager describing the situation as a national scandal. 4 out of 5 health leaders said the lack of care services in the community was the main reason why medically fit people ended up stuck in hospitals. Most of those questions believe an immediate increase in pay for care staff would be the single change the government could make to ease the pressures.
Police in Bangladesh believe a family of 5 from Cardiff who fell ill while on holiday in the country was deliberately poisoned. A man and his 16-year-old son have died. His wife and 2 other children are in hospital. Akbar Hussain reports from Dhaka.
The family came to Bangladesh on a 2-month visit to see their ancestral home in Sylhet district. They were staying in a rented apartment. Police officers broke into the building on Tuesday morning after relatives raised the alarm. 51-year-old Rafiqul Islam and his 16-year-old son Mohikul Islam died on their way to hospital. Rafiqul Islam's wife and his 2 other children are being treated in a hospital and are in a critical condition. Police suspect the family was deliberately poisoned. A number of people have been questioned, including close relatives, but no arrests have been made.
The US Central Bank has announced another large interest rate hike as it battles to rein in soaring prices in the world's largest economy. The Federal Reserve said it would increase its key rate by 0.75%. Inflation in the US is running at more than 9%. From Washington, here's Gary O'Donoghue.
This is the fourth rise in rates this year, and it won't be the last. Speaking after the announcement, the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said even though there were signs of demand easing, with consumer spending and business investment slowing, there could yet be more unusually high increases in rates later in the year. He told reporters he did not believe the US was currently in a recession, as there were too many indicators pointing away from that conclusion, such as the strength of the labour market, which has seen more than 2.5 million jobs created this year.
The latest annual climate report from the Met Office shows sea levels are rising more quickly around the UK as temperatures continue to increase. The research also shows that the country's warming faster than the global average. Here's our science correspondent, Victoria Gill.
While many have felt the effects of the recent extreme climate-fueled heatwave, this latest Met Office report confirms that the UK is on a steady upward temperature trend. The country is warming slightly faster than the average pace of global temperature increase. One of the starkest impacts for the UK is sea level rise. Since the 1900s, sea levels have risen by about 16.5 centimetres. They're continuing to rise, and the rate at which that's happening, this study shows, is accelerating. More coastal communities, roads and railways will need to be protected from surging seas, floods and storms. But holding back the most damaging impacts of climate change, scientists say, requires deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions that this report shows is becoming increasingly urgent.
Football, and England will face Germany in the final of the Women's Euros on Sunday at Wembley. The German team beat France 2-1 in their semi-final at Milton Keynes last night.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. It's just turned 9 minutes past 7. Overnight, there was another big hike in interest rates in the United States. The 0.75 of a point increase announced by the Federal Reserve comes as inflation in America is running at more than 9%. Some economists are now warning that this latest move risks making it more, not less likely, that the US and therefore much of the rest of the industrialised world, including the UK, will tip into recession. Amongst those who is gloomy is Professor Danny Blanchflower of Dartmouth College in the US. He was a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, that's the interest rate setting committee, during the 2008 financial crisis. I spoke to him just before we went on air and asked him, what did he make of this decision?
Well, it was exactly what the markets were expecting. It was a unanimous decision and probably totally wrong. What the Fed is doing really has very little impact on an inflation caused by supply-side problems from the war in Ukraine and basically coming out of a pandemic. And the likelihood is that these actions will generate a recession that the Fed is very worried about and the President of the United States is worried about, because in about 12 hours' time we're going to find out if there's the second negative quarter of output growth, and we're going to argue about whether that means it's a recession.
And if you're right, what does that mean for the British economy?
Well, I think a good way to think of all this is in 2008, just the same thing. People denied that there was a recession coming, and all we were to worry about was inflation. And if you look back, the United States went into recession in December 2007, and every other European country, Germany, France, Sweden, Italy, the UK, all went in together. So I think it's probably one down, all down, and we're all probably going to go down into recession together, just like we did last time.
Now, you have always been an economist that's warned about the dangers of unemployment rather than inflation, but there are plenty who say inflation is the real evil. That line you will have heard of over the years, if it isn't hurting, it isn't working, and a recession as the price to get inflation out of the system may be worth paying, some argue.
Well, I disagree with that completely. I thought you might ask me that. So I went and looked. And under Thatcher, what it turned out was that, in fact, it took about 7 years to get inflation back from 7% when she came into office to 3%. And she entered office with an unemployment of 5.3%. And it took 20 years to get back to that. So unemployment takes a long time to get back. A 1 percentage point rise in unemployment hurts people much more than a 1 percentage point rise in inflation. If you measure it in terms of pain and sadness, it's about 10 times worse to have a spell of unemployment than a spell of inflation. So that's just not true.
Are you really arguing that in this debate we're seeing about the leadership of the Conservative Party and therefore about the country, that the suggestion that the Bank of England should act to deal with inflation, acting meaning higher interest rates, that is a mistake?
Well, I think that the UK, in all likelihood, is actually in recession already. The right thing for them to do is to sit back and wait and watch as the global recession probably spreads. The last thing you really need to do is to make matters worse by raising rates. And the idea that you might think about raising rates to 7%, as Liz Truss has suggested that her advisor Patrick Minford thinks is a good idea, would be absolutely crazy thing to do.
I should just stress, Danny, that she's never suggested it, and even Minford claims that he didn't really say that.
Well, okay. I did look that up also, and it was also true that never in the entire period when Thatcher was in office did the interest rate go below 7%. Well, I think the answer is that the stories that we were hearing from the Bank of England, from the governor, from the chief economist about we have to raise rates, well, that was fine, but these are inflations caused by a supply side problem, not a demand side. And the danger is that you don't generate a soft landing and you generate a very hard landing. And the problem is, what are the authorities going to do?
Just one last one to you. You know what some listeners are thinking. Professor Blanchefleur, they think, he's a bit of an Eeyore. He's always been gloomy about unemployment. Wasn't he that bloke who predicted it'd be 5 million in the past?
Well, I never said that, actually. I said, actually, that if the central bank and the authorities hadn't acted, that potentially would have been what would have happened to unemployment. It didn't go there because the authorities acted. And if the authorities don't act and don't kill this burgeoning recession from coming, it's going to be very bad. And so we're in a position where anybody who's going to become the Prime Minister has to answer that question and say, if this happens, this is what I'm going to do. And I wait to hear from them with interest.
As do we all. Professor Danny Blanchefleur, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
The time now is 14 minutes past 7.
Should Labour stand in solidarity with workers striking to secure higher pay? Or should a party eyeing a return to government insist that soaring prices will get worse if pay rises keep pace with inflation? Questions raised by the sacking by Keir Starmer of Sam Tarry, a Labour transport spokesperson. During yesterday's rail strike, he stood on an RMT picket line to give a series of interviews that didn't stick to the party line that Labour does not take sides. This is Terry, before he heard the news he'd been sacked, being interviewed on Channel 4 News.
Is standing on this picket line worth losing your job for? It's not about my job, it's about the jobs of 40,000 rail workers. They're the people that are actually making the difficult decisions today. All I'm doing is standing up for what's right and for what's just.
That sounds like a yes then.
It's not about yes or no, it's about being really
you might lose your job over standing here.
I don't believe I'll lose my job. At the end of the day, that's not my decision. It's always worth it to be standing shoulder to shoulder with striking workers. I'm a trade unionist, first, a Labour MP, second.
Well, he is no longer a shadow minister. Listening to that is Diane Abbott, former shadow Home Secretary, ally, of course, of Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party. Morning to you, Diana.
Good morning, Nick.
Now, you know the rules. If you're a shadow minister, you've got to stick to the line, even if you don't like it, don't you? It was inevitable that Sam Tarry was going to be sacked after that, wasn't it?
Well, you had Rachel Reeves on this very programme last week claiming that the Labour Party wasn't going to nationalise the railways, and she had to be put right by actual transport spokesperson. So if Rachel Reeves can make up policy, I don't know what the criticism of Sam Tarry is.
Do you think that Keir Starmer, a man who gave a whole series of pledges saying that he was broadly in line with Jeremy Corbyn's vision of policy in the Labour Party, he's letting you down?
I don't think he's letting me down, but he did make 10 pledges very emphatically, and he's dropped every single one of them. But the important thing is not whether he's let me down. The important thing is what the public makes of this. And one of the reasons why the RMT strike has a lot of support